It's January 1945, and it looks like finally, after a half-decade of war, the war in Europe will finally come to a close sometime in the late spring or early summer. And with this brings pressing questions that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin have to address, and they're questions that they feel they can only address in person. So they decide that they're going to have a conference together at the Lavadia Palace on the Black Sea, the farthest west that Stalin will go.
Yalta on the Black Sea was the scene of a Big Three meeting.
Here starts a series of talks that will profoundly influence the diplomatic and political future of the world.
February 1945, they're starting to plan the post-war world. And you have three people that see the world very differently.
The Big Three arrive at Yalta with distinct goals. Roosevelt wants to bring the Soviet Union into the war against the Japanese. But Roosevelt also has a personal goal that's looking even farther into the future. After the war's over, he wants to create a new organization for international peace, the United Nations.
FDR believes the United Nations will help the world resolve its problems, will help de-escalate militarism, and make the world a safer place into the future.
For Churchill and Stalin, their objectives from Yalta are really centered around Poland. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty in 1939, and the Polish government has been in exile in London ever since. Churchill wants to make sure that when all of this is over, that Poland is free, that they are independent and have self-determination. Stalin wants to make sure that they are going to have a government in Poland that's controlled by Stalin.
FDR never thought that Soviets and Americans ultimately had the same political ideals. But as a tough political leader, Roosevelt knew at the beginning of 1945 the only way to finish off this war is to keep the Soviets fighting, and that may mean allowing Stalin to do a lot of things that Roosevelt would have preferred that he not do.
Каждый раз, когда немцы вторглись в мою страну, они сделали это через Польшу. Так что Польша должна иметь правительство, которое дружественное с Советским Союзом. Я уверен, что вы понимаете, что для нас это обсуждение не подлежит.
Of course, we want Poland's government to be friendly. But most importantly, it must be decided by the Polish people.
Which means, Marshal Stalin, the members of the Polish administration who've been taking refuge in my country should be included in the government. But you have shut them out and put your own people in.
А что думает о этом президент Рузвельт?
I'm assuming that you will honor our previous agreement that Poland will enjoy free elections under American and British supervision.
В Польше более миллиона советских войсков. Сколько американцев? Мы те, кто пожертвовали так много, чтобы освободить Европу от нацистов. Итак, мы будем теми, кто обеспечит их демократию.
Then swear to me that you will guarantee free elections in Poland.
Я обещаю. Надеюсь, моего слова будет достаточно.
I will need your word on something else, too. I want you to join the war against Japan.
The legacy of Yalta was complicated. When they depart, they have reached agreements that are going to lead to peace, to a better world. And yet Churchill is deeply concerned that Stalin has no intention of honoring his agreements, especially when it comes to guaranteeing free elections in Poland. Roosevelt does succeed in drawing the Soviet Union into his plan for the United Nations. He also walks away with a commitment from Stalin to join the fight in the Pacific.
We now look back on the Yalta Conference, 1945, and many people would say, Why did Roosevelt give up Eastern Europe? Was it because he was old and sick? No, it was because the Soviet army owned an awful lot of Europe, and no matter how charming or how angry Roosevelt got at this conference, his personal skill was not enough to overcome that.
Roosevelt believed that he was going to keep going back to Stalin to negotiate issue by issue as things unfolded. He didn't see Yalta as this climactic act. It was not supposed to be the final word.
Mrs. Roosevelt.
Yes.
I'm sorry, but you're needed at the White House right away.
Right away?
Eleanor gave her talk, and she said she knew that something dreadful had happened.
As his cousin Daisy Suckley said, Franklin Roosevelt, the hope of the world, has died.
Eleanor summons Vice President Truman to the White House, and she puts her hand on his shoulder, and she says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman says, "Oh, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry. You know, what can I do for you?" And she says, "That's the wrong question, because you're the one that's in trouble now."
From his beloved second home at Warm Springs, Georgia, the body of Franklin Delano Roosevelt moves on the first stages of its journey to his final resting place.
There's immense public grieving. There's this sense that the glue that had held the country together had cracked. That someone who had seemed perennial was actually temporal. And the New York Times that day wrote, "Men will thank God on their knees 1,000 years from now that Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House when he was." There was a daily government list of casualties that went out. And the top casualty that day was Roosevelt Franklin Delano, Commander-in-Chief.
There was a sense of his being the only president for lots of people that they'd ever known. 12 years is a long time. Having carried them through the Depression, carried them through the war, feeling a sense of connection to him. The kids who went to the civilian conservation camps become the soldiers in World War II. There's this story of somebody who's crying during the funeral, and they say to him, an old man, he's crying, "Did you know President Roosevelt?" He said, "No, but he knew me."
Franklin Roosevelt rescued democracy and capitalism in their hours of maximum danger. And the fact that we have a market economy and a republic, if we can keep it, is in no small measure because of his fundamental belief in the constitutional order.
Ambition is the most mysterious part of leadership. FDR had this ambition that's large, but it's for something larger than himself.
FDR had this great gift for understanding what the American people needed.
FDR made us better than we are. He could call on our better angels.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
There was something about that voice, there was something about that smile that suggested it's gonna be okay.
Roosevelt opened the eyes of Americans to positive effects that government could have on individual lives.
Everybody talks at the end about how he'll be remembered for having gotten us through the Depression, carrying us through World War II, and there's Social Security and all these things you can see in the history books. He would say, it's the bond with the people that I've established and that I care for. Underneath all those laws are people, and there are people whose lives he's affected and people who he helped to get them back on their feet in the 30s, to be ready to be the greatest generation in the 40s. And I think that's what he'd want to be remembered for.
Americans have always been lucky. We got Lincoln when we needed him, we had Washington when we needed him, and we had FDR when we needed him.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.